Hello, welcome, Cabbage here. So, I've been talking a lot about the Japanese mobile game industry lately. I've been following it for about 10 years, but have never made a concentrated effort to cover it until now. Part of the reason why I'm talking about it is because the industry is going through a sea change, perhaps the biggest since when Puzzles and Dragons essentially invented the industry, when smartphones were brand new. I want to say first that the Japanese mobile game industry is not going anywhere anytime soon. As long as smartphones remain popular, and as long as their form factor doesn't change, and as long as Japanese people love pulling the hatcher, the industry will stay. VR or AR may someday overtake smartphones in popularity and use. I'm not thinking that's going to happen within 10 years. But until then, more people are walking around with smartphones today than people have owned console gaming machines in the history of gaming, I'm guessing. So that is a big market to tap. It is a gold rush and has been since the early 2010s, but what is changing now is the shift in business model and the shift in which countries have successful publishers and developers, and the shift in what markets publishers are aiming for. A seismic event occurred. That was the release of Genshin by Chinese developer MiHoYo, and it was so out of nowhere and impactful on the industry, it is called the Genshin shock even today. And it wasn't just in Japan. It made waves across the world. It made big publishers like Microsoft and Sony sit up and take notice, and Microsoft is still kicking itself for passing on the game. The model was new. Make a console quality game, practically a full game, give it to everyone for free, release it on multiple platforms, and then add a hatcher to drive revenue. The polish and the prettiness of the game was shocking at the time, and 3 years later, it kind of still hasn't been matched except by maybe Uma Musume, another great success released around the same time. I might talk about that game in another video. Korea has a longer history of game development and publishing, and their roots are in net games like MapleStory and Ragnarok Online. But over time, they have added mobile games aimed at the Japanese market, kind of specializing in MMOs like Lineage or Ni no Kuni, and then more kind of traditional mobile games like Nikke recently. And so where we are now in 2023, if you look at like certain statistics about the mobile game industry here in Japan, we see that Japanese developed games and non-Japanese developed games are performing kind of similarly, like in terms of like what rate they shut down, like 60% shut down within 2 years, where they sit in the rankings of like, daily, weekly, monthly sales. The average of that is pretty similar as well. It is legitimately shocking. 5 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine. And as a result, there are a lot of people in the Japanese gaming community saying that Japanese developed and published mobile games are done. That's a bit dramatic, but what is clear is that Japanese companies need to adapt with their game design and business model to compete with these non-Japanese developed games. Here I'll lay out the types of games that are successful today in 2023 and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Japanese companies and non-Japanese companies. But first, there are legacy games. Second, there are niche games. And then third, there are once-in-a-generation hits like Genshin and Uma Musume. Legacy games are the pioneers like Monster Strike and Fate Grand Order. They have old-fashioned business models and old-fashioned gameplay that would not work in games released today, but they're so entrenched that loyalty and popularity and ecosystem gives the games inertia to help them continue to succeed, and they are so rolling in money that they can afford to be super generous in-game and out-of-game. Niche games come in two types. They are either games based on popular IPs, or they are girl collectors. It seems too simple, but attractive characters draw players to a game and can keep them there. And yeah, really, any game released these days has to be one or the other, or both. And then, the once-in-a-generation hits are, of course, very rare. They either have to reinvent the wheel, like Genshin, or they have to achieve perfect alchemy of the standard model with a sky-high level of polish, like Uma Musume. Both types take a long time to develop. Genshin took 3.5 years, and Uma Musume started over halfway through their development. And most companies are not going to invest that amount of time and money. So they are much more likely to go for the niche route and then fight for the scraps left over by the legacy games and the generational games. Like before Genshin and Uma Musume were released and had great success, it was very difficult for new games to debut high and then stay there. Just year after year after year, the legacy games have been sitting at the top. Here I thought I would lay out a few characteristics of Japanese companies so that we can get a better idea of why they are in this pinch and what they can do from here. Maybe most importantly, Japan is the land of intellectual properties, decades of games and manga and anime to draw from. And a lot of games have made a lot of money up to now purely because of the IP, and sometimes in spite of shaky reliability, incompetent developers, mediocre gameplay. But you think about Chinese and Korean publishers, they have close to zero IPs to work with. So what they do to compete is polish the presentation, really work to make the gameplay compelling, and put a lot of resources into making the game run smoothly. Really put in a lot of user support. And I think those are big reasons why they have caught up to Japan. The Japanese IPs are a bottomless well to draw from, but perhaps they are also a crutch. Also, and it's hard to get evidence on this, I feel like there's a disconnect between publishers and developers in Japan. Publishers, spend money to have the games developed, and then if games go over schedule or over budget, publishers will often say, just go ahead and release it, even if the game needs more work. And that has led to a lot of kind of weird game releases, a lot of game failures, and then quick shutdowns. This side of the industry doesn't really get seen by the global side because there's a lot of crap that comes out that does not exit Japan. But because of the high rate of release and shutdown in Japanese mobile gaming, I feel like Japanese users are jaded. They feel like the companies are not valuing the games that they put out, and so why should players value the games? And so that's why whenever bigger companies like Sega or Square Enix release a new mobile game, it instantly gets dumped on, just because of the reputation of the releases up to now. And so those are the biggest reasons why folks are catching up to Japan within their own country. But there's another theory floating around that will be difficult to confirm, but that is that just the amount of effort put in by non-Japanese developers appears to be higher. What I mean by that is that Japanese game development used to be called a black industry, meaning they overworked and underpaid their workers. But lately the industry has become white, with better hours, better pay, more benefits, more opportunities, etc. This is great for the workers, of course, but perhaps it could be a factor in games getting released or updated less quickly with less polish. Meanwhile, in Korea and China, we just don't know what their game development working conditions are like, but their games look and play pretty darn good, and they come out pretty rapidly. It could be because they are in a startup mentality, Small, scrappy team, sleeping at the company to get the work in. So Japan may be at a disadvantage in that sense, but no confirmation there. So, thinking about all of this, what can Japan do? Although it did take them a while to react to the Genshin shock, I think Japanese companies are taking actions already, and one of them is to scale back their footprint in mobile. In the last year, we've seen kind of the three biggest game companies that make mobile games, Square Enix, Sega, and Bandai Namco, scale back their games, shut a lot down, and shut them down quickly. And by lowering the number of mobile games released, they can focus more resources on the games they do release, and then better compete with non-Japanese developers on polish and support and gameplay. The Japanese developer Sai Games has one of the best reputations, and we can see from how they work why they are successful. They are picky about what they release, they put in the time and money needed before release, and then after release they play the long game and gain players through word of mouth. They are kind of the industry darling in Japan right now, and other companies hopefully follow their process. But that leads me to my next topic, which is efforts to appeal to the global market, and Sai Games does not do this at all. But we look at a lot of the best-selling, the most successful Japan-developed games, and they don't have global versions at all. And then I took a real quick look at the North American App Store on Apple, look at their sales numbers, and there were like, I think there were 0 Japanese developed games in there. There was Genshin and Honkai Star Rail, and then a bunch of like non-Japanese developed games like Clash of Clans and like Marvel stuff. But I have to wonder if more companies are going to go the way of Cygames and then stop developing for global, just because the revenue is never going to be there. Except in certain cases where, like as a promotional tool, it could be useful to release the game in global, even if they know that they're not going to make the money back on it. But like part of the reason why mobile games exist is to kind of fill the gap in between, big name console releases. Like in between, Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 16, you have all of these Final Fantasy mobile games to fill the gap. And that's just to keep the property like alive, in the minds of the players who might be around the world. But yeah, the Japanese market is still the number one, which is why Chinese and Korean companies develop to target that. What I'm interested to see going forward is if Japanese companies follow the Genshin model of creating essentially a console game, playable on multiple platforms, and giving it to everyone for free. This is a tremendous and risky investment beforehand, and it kind of goes against decades of game development practices in Japan. I talked about Korea making their name on net games. Japan made their name on console games, and it explains some of their stumbles with the mobile market for reasons I've talked about elsewhere. And it makes me skeptical that they would adopt the Genshin model in any big way. I think Japanese developers understand that their strength is console games, and on that front, Japan is doing great. We got Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, Resident Evil 4 Remake, Street Fighter 6, these are all big hits. So the Japanese game industry overall is not in trouble, I would say, but I do see it stepping back from mobile, maybe focusing more on Japan, less on global, and then relinquishing more of the market to non-Japanese companies, and then focusing on their strength, which again is console. Another thing that'll be interesting to see is if Chinese and Korean developers start to develop and publish for console, and then if this kind of multi-platform approach is the future. Okay, so those are my thoughts on the Japanese mobile game industry in 2023. If you have any insight on anything, I would be very interested to hear it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again. Take care.